Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ted, for inviting us to speak. Thanks to the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. The program note to start out with is we've got a lot of slides. And we are going to show them all. And that means that some of the topics in Footprints in New York are going to go by kind of quickly, but that's only so that we can spend a little more time on other topics. So we're just going to run through, hold your questions, and let's get started. And that's the name of our talk.
So neither of us are native New Yorkers, though, as you'll read in the first chapter of Footprints in New York, James has a family history that goes back in New York to the 1650s. But we each moved to New York for college. I moved here, I guess I don't have to say the year, for Columbia as an undergraduate, and James moved here for NYU, and we met through a mutual friend. And we, on our weekends, would just spend our free time exploring new neighborhoods, reading a lot about New York, collecting old postcards, and then in late 2000, we got this idea to start a walking tour business. So that's how we started doing this. We're self-taught. It's not what we studied in school. Relates in some ways, but not exactly. We give tours, as Ted said, all over the city, primarily in Manhattan, some in Brooklyn, and very rarely would we escort people to the other boroughs, I'm sorry to say. We explore them on our own, but so we do Lower Manhattan tour, this is the Customs House, we do Central Park. In this neighborhood, we do a Greenwich Village tour that we can do a literary tour, a more architectural tour, but this is one of the most famous spots. Most of you probably know the 75.5 Bedford Street, the narrowest house in the city. And so we mix it up. We do lots of fun, different things. As Ted mentioned, our first book was a Frommer's book, strictly walking tours, self-guided walking tours. Our next book, Inside the Apple, A Streetwise History of New York City, was not trying to be a walking tour book, but is instead a chronological history of the city in 182 short chapters, each of them place-based, so very much based upon our experience as tour guides. And then at the end of the book, we tell you how to create your own tours, so sort of in an appendix. We'll say, if you want to take a self-guided tour of Greenwich Village, start in Washington Square Park and read chapter 32, which will go on for half a page. Walk 3 blocks north and read chapter 47, which goes on for a page and a half, and then so you string it together in that way. Then that brings us to our recently published book, Footprints in New York, Tracing the Lives of 4 Centuries of New Yorkers. It is, again, a history of New York City, but what we've done here is taken biographies of individuals who help us get into a certain time period, and then within that, we again are very place-based. We go to places that still exist, or in some instances, the spot where something used to exist, but we really like to see places that are still there to get into a certain time period. So the book toggles back and forth between a third-person history and / biography and first-person narrative of our particular explorations, either with our tour guiding clients or just individually or together, going to fun spots that are associated with the individuals, associated with the time periods.
So these are some of the folks that we're going to be talking about tonight that, we kind of went through the book. We're going to talk a little bit about every chapter in the book, but these are the folks who have particular connections to Greenwich Village. Some of these faces you're going to recognize, some of these faces you probably have no idea who they are. And that's one of the things we also, was a real goal of this book, was to not just be a catalog of famous faces, but to look at eras through the lives of people with whom you might not be so familiar. And the women, yes. So we start at the beginning of time. So there's Greenwich Village as it looked like before anybody got here. We begin with the Dutch. The first 2 chapters of the book are about Dutch colonial New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam itself was at the southern tip of Manhattan Island, but that doesn't mean that there weren't things going on here. Peter Stuyvesant had the bowery that gave its name to the bowery. That is 3 pictures in that slide of his farm, which was somewhere in the East Village. I'm absolutely certain none of those is an accurate representation of what the building actually... Never trust these 19th century, just don't. If it's a 19th century illustration of something that happened in the 17th century, just ignore it. So those are in the East Village. What you can go to, however, is that's Peter Stuyvesant's grave, which is in the churchyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery. So that is one of the few places where we know where an actually important Dutch person was buried. And the book opens with a tour guiding client of mine standing on top of that grave and saying, "Who's Peter Stuyvesant?" Because, especially if you're not from around here, it's one of those names that's sort of vaguely familiar. So the other thing that is, so can I just say that we pick a lot of slides and then we make up the talk as we go along. So sometimes I have to wait for the slide to know what I want to talk about. The other thing we talk about in the beginning is my history, which Michelle alluded to. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather came here in 1652 to be a merchant, and then that little yellow box you see outlined on the sidewalk there on Pearl Street was the outline of the Dutch Stadthouse, which was where he lived. There's a slide. The next slide is showing Peter Stuyvesant with his wooden leg. I like to think talking to my ancestor outside of City Hall, but who knows if that's the case. So after a couple of chapters about the Dutch, we have one chapter about the most forgotten era in New York City history, which is the English colonial period. This is Fraunces Tavern, which was once the home of a man named Stephen Delancey, who was the person we used to get into that era, is to study the history of the Delancey family. Then we move on to Alexander Hamilton. It's sort of tracing the places he would have gone the last weekend of his life, or the last week of his life, which means starting up in his home in Harlem, which you can go visit, and if you haven't, please do. Then heading out to Weehawken to see the place where Aaron Burr, vice president and Greenwich Village resident, shot him. And then heading to the place where he was taken mortally wounded. And I'm actually going to read a little excerpt. We're not going to read a lot from the book. I'm not a big fan of that. But here's a little excerpt from the Alexander Hamilton chapter. After he was shot, Hamilton was ferried across the river. Let's put the glasses on. There we go. These are new. He was ferried across the river to the home of his friend William Bayard on Jane Street. Bayard was from one of the oldest and richest families in the city. He was the great-great-great-nephew of Judith Bayard, wife of Peter Stuyvesant, and he owned vast property in what is now Greenwich Village. Hamilton was carried to a second-floor bedroom where Dr. Hosack attended to him. A rider was dispatched to Hamilton Grange to fetch Eliza, his wife, but only to tell her that Hamilton was suffering from, quote, spasms. He had hidden the duel from her in advance, but he could hide it no longer. This chapter is having just come back from Weehawken. Back in Manhattan, I step off the ferry, and I head towards Greenwich Village. It's just a few weeks after Hurricane Sandy has decimated much of the East Coast. But in this part of Manhattan, signs of the storm are few and far between. Still, when I reach the block of Jane Street that once housed William Bayard's country manor, I find myself squelching through mud. When Bayard owned this land, his house was practically at the water's edge. Hamilton would have been carried up a short dock to Bayard's front door. I snap a few photos of the front of 8082 Jane Street. That is the building that replaced Bayard's farm. But 2 men on the other side of the street scowl at me. I had no idea until I was putting this talk together that I had actually snapped a picture of the snowling guys. They look like Mormon missionaries or maybe insurance adjusters. Am I encroaching on their territory? Since I have had nothing but duels on my mind for days, I scurry away before they can ask me any questions. So after we visit where he actually died, the chapter ends with getting him to Trinity Church, where his burial site is. I don't know what comes after this. Oh, next chapter is DeWitt Clinton, my hero. We're not really going to talk about him much, but he is the, among other things, mayor who was responsible for the commissioner's plan of 1811, which put a grid He was not himself a commissioner, but the leading commissioner was a guy named Governor Morris. This is my absolute favorite picture of Governor Morris of all time. If you ride the number 1 train and you get on or off at Christopher Street, there are these fantastic tiles in the subway station done by students from PS 41 and a tile master named Lee Boards-Gold. And that is supposed to be Governor Morris chopping down somebody's tree while they're putting the grid in place. I'm here to tell you Governor Morris did not go around chopping down trees, but it's a fantastic interpretation of what the grid meant to the people whose land was being taken away so that streets could be run through. I absolutely love this. Is another piece of it. That's John Reed, the guy in the black hat. We'll talk about him a little bit later. The next chapter then brings us to Gertrude Treadwell. I'm going to turn things over to Michelle.
I'm going to read from the book again. This is the beginning of the Gertrude Treadwell chapter. Maybe you'll think I'm a little younger because I'm not wearing glasses. Gertrude Treadwell at home in Greenwich Village. In 1950, Olivia de Havilland won an Academy Award for her ability to navigate a staircase. The movie was The Heiress, and at various points in the film, she eagerly runs down the stairs, tearfully ascends them, and in the climax, climbs slowly and deliberately away from the man banging on her front door. I'm not being sardonic. De Havilland is a superb actress throughout the film, but in these silent moments, where she communicates with nothing more than a look, she embodies the emotional life and transformation of her character, Catherine Sloper. The story, based on Henry James's novella Washington Square, follows Catherine's doomed love for Morris Townsend, played by Montgomery Clift. Catherine is the only child of the widowed Dr. Austin Sloper, who doesn't think she'll ever amount to much or live up to his idealized remembrances of her departed mother. When Townsend comes calling with amorous intentions, Dr. Sloper assures Catherine that Townsend is just after her money, a $10,000 a year inheritance from her mother, and the promise of $20,000 more when her father dies. I won't detail how it all plays out, but no one is happy in the end. In the film and in the novel, both set in the 1840s, the Slopers' house is located at 16 Washington Square. At the time, this would have been one of the finest addresses in New York. Still, I can't help but think, as I watched de Havilland ascending that staircase, that I've seen it somewhere before, and not on Washington Square. In fact, while the Hollywood sets for The Heiress are a hybrid of various mid-century New York townhouses, that staircase is a replica of one in a home only a few blocks away at 29 East 4th Street. Today, known as the Merchant's House Museum, it is the best preserved early 19th century townhouse in the city, and its preservation owes much to the fact that from 1835 until 1933, it was occupied by just one family, that of hardware merchant Seabury Treadwell. Seabury Treadwell's youngest daughter, Gertrude, was born in the house in 1840 and died there in 1933. In those 93 years, amazingly, very little had changed. She'd kept the furnishings her father had brought with them when they first moved in. Even the chandeliers were still gas. As the city grew and changed around Gertrude, she was holding on to the past. Without intending to, she had maintained much more than a house. She'd preserved an entire way of life. So that's an example of how we use a not necessarily very well-known person, not a famous person, to get into a time period and use that house and her story and some of the ideas about women in that period to get back to the 1840s and 1850s.
Hand that to you. So it also leads us into more of the architecture that was sort of blossoming at this period when this neighborhood was called, quote unquote, above Bleecker. And it was the first time that people were living out of the city, where rich people were living out of the city in large numbers. So this is a drawing of LaGrange Terrace on Lafayette Street. LaGrange was the Marquis de Lafayette's country house in France. Everybody knows it by its nickname Colonnade Row. This is what it looks like today, I'm sorry to say. It actually doesn't even look that good right now because the columns are swathed in protective covering because they're in such bad shape. And it was one of the finest it was the finest place to live in New York City. It had, this is years before the Croton Aqueduct system is built, but you had flush toilets if you lived in Cullen. How did they do that? That then moves us on to talk about not only the creation of Washington Square in 1826, but keeping with this architecture theme, the creation of the Row, which is where Catherine Sloper would have lived. And this nearly identical set of townhouses. This chapter was one of the first ones we wrote for the book, and it's kind of an odd collection of sort of paths that we tread a lot in Greenwich Village. So to get into this era, we also walked down Grove Street, which is one of our absolute favorites, because it's one of the things we do on tours. I mean, we get people over to St. Luke in the Fields, which was completed just before everybody moved to Greenwich Village. So it's like the last remnant of the village as a village. Then we take people to see the William Hyde House. I love this picture of it. It still shows it when it was still an apartment building. That's at the corner in its middle period. So it was a house, and then it was an apartment building, and now it's a house again. It's at the corner of Grove and what, Bedford? Barrow? Bedford. If you don't know it, it's at the corner of Grove and Bedford. And you know, the story we tell in the book is that we're sitting there talking about wood frame houses and window sash makers and 1822 yellow fever outbreaks, and everybody's pulling out their camera so they can take a picture of this, which is the apartment building from Friends, which is right across the street. So we move on from there to another famous denizen of Greenwich Village, Edgar Allan Poe. This chapter concentrates on a few different things. I don't know what the next slide is. It starts out with the idea that Poe today is hands down the most famous American author of his era. And this was not the case in his own lifetime. This was a painting later turned into a print of all the famous American authors of its day. That's Washington Irving in the center. This is the one picture that's reproduced in the Poe chapter. And that is all of his acolytes around him. And there is, even though Poe was friends with all these people, there's no Poe in this picture. And one of the reasons was that Poe spent a lot of his time stabbing people in the back, including writing all sorts of literary essays about his friends, about how terrible they were. Plagiarists, you know, hacks, that sort of thing. This is just a nice picture looking south from Union Square. This would have been in Poe's lifetime when Poe was living in the village, so everything's spreading out on the right side of that slide. This is his wife, Virginia Clem, who was also his first cousin, who was also 13. Though he called her Sissy, and they may never have consummated the marriage. This is a map of all of the places in New York City associated with Poe from a now long out of print biography. It was a very great resource for us, but as you discover later on, people write a lot of things that you can't then find a second source for. But the house of Poe's we talk about the most is this one, on Amity Street, now known as West 3rd Street. It was, when it was still standing, one of only 2 remaining Poe houses in New York City. And when NYU wanted to build a law school extension, they tore it down and they built this. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, you can just read the book. just read the book. We also go to the Northern Dispensary, where Poe may or may not have gone, and finish up at Poe Cottage in the Bronx. This is the greatest picture you're ever going to see of Poe Cottage. This is a hotel room at the Dearborn Inn in Dearborn, Michigan, which was built to be an exact, perfect 100% size replica of Poe Cottage. And if you ever find yourself in Dearborn, you can stay inside Poe Cottage as a hotel room, which is just awesome. But if you haven't been up to the Bronx, it's in the Fordham section of that neighborhood, and you should visit the real thing because you can see Poe's writing desk, and to me, most movingly, you can see the bed in which young Virginia died of tuberculosis after they had piled every piece of clothing in the house on top of her to try to keep her warm. It's a very moving sight. I just wanted to show you his obituary because they made a funny. You know, quoth the raven, nevermore. Really, that's your lead for Poe's obituary? All right, moving right along. The next chapter is Central Park, which is about Frederick Law Olmsted. and Calvert Vaux, who you know in this neighborhood as being part of the team that built Jefferson Market. That's by a guy named Frederick Clark Withers, but he was Vaux's partner, and it has a lot of Vauxian overtones to it. Then our next village chapter brings us to Abraham Lincoln. This picture was taken in Greenwich Village at Matthew Brady's studio on Lincoln's way to give his Might Makes Right speech at Cooper Union, which was the speech that won him won him the nomination, which ultimately won him the presidency. Would never have been president without his trip to New York. So our concentrating on the Civil War is to concentrate on him, and we also pay a quick visit to McSorley's. I'm just pointing this out because they happen to have a wanted poster. John Wilkes Booth, among the many artifacts inside McSorley's is a John Wilkes Booth poster. Then there's a chapter about Boss Tweed. It's awesome, read it. And then we move on to the Gilded Age.
So this is Edith Wharton, and our chapter is a dual look at Edith Wharton and her cousin, Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor. So a lot of the characters in Edith Wharton novels are people that she knows, or based on people that she knows or was related to. That was Carolyn Astor. This is Carolyn Astor's famous ballroom. So the phrase, the 400, comes from the number of people that could fit into her ballroom comfortably. So if you were a member of the in crowd, the 400, you would get invited to these things. And it seems like Edith Wharton was a little bit on the fringes of things. It doesn't seem like she was part of that inner circle. So we don't know exactly how much they overlapped. We talk about that a little bit in the chapter. The portrait of Carolyn Astor that we showed a few images back is where she would stand in front of that portrait as she greeted guests to her balls. This is a scene from Martin Scorsese's Age of Innocence. And the character in Age of Innocence that's based on Mrs. Astor is Mrs. Beaufort. And she is in this image. Scorsese filmed this at the National Arts Club. And she's standing in front of the portrait of her that's based on the actual Astor. So there's a lot of Wharton-Astor connections that we have fun pointing out in that chapter. I don't know what's next. So we look at the 1880s from a few different perspectives. We have this Gilded Age chapter talking about the well-to-do, but then we have a chapter that looks at Jacob Riis and Lillian Wald and the work that they are doing and the poverty that they are exposing on the Lower East Side. So that's a Jacob Riis photograph. His famous work is How the Other Half Lives. And the next image, we go to the Brooklyn Bridge. Also working somewhat in the same time period.
All right, I'll take it. The next chapter is about the Brooklyn Bridge. It's actually about Seth Low, who should be more famous than he is, who was the mayor of Brooklyn, who advocated for Brooklyn and Manhattan to be united into one city. He later went on to be the mayor of the unified New York City. In between, he was president of Columbia. And so it's sort of an interesting way. This is the exact same time period. We actually devote kind of 4 chapters of the book. And that's a little bit just because we have a real deep interest in the Gilded Age, but it's also because once you start getting to post-Civil War New York, there are a lot of places. We haven't torn it all down. Then we do a chapter about J.P. Morgan, where we're avid runners, and so we run this 15-mile course trying to link together all the places that, not all of them, but many of the places that are associated with J.P. Morgan. This is from that same subway station. The woman you see in the center is supposed to be Mabel Dodge, who ran the Grand Salon on Fifth Avenue. And the person that is over on the left-hand side of the slide, I have the pointer. Yeah. I'll give this to you. You can do the slides. That's Max Eastman. So it's supposed to be Max Eastman in that first slide, and then, that's supposed to be Max Eastman. Trust me on this. And that is a much better picture of Max Eastman. If you haven't had the chance yet, the New School Thomas Hart Benton painting that was done for them, that later went to AXA Equitable, has just recently been installed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's New York, it's all of these fantastic New York scenes. And he was friends with Max Eastman, and so paints him in this subway scene And I went in and snapped that picture because the guard said, they haven't told me that people can't take pictures, so until they say that you can't take pictures. So, Max Eastman was, for many years, editor. He was of The Masses, the leading communist magazine in America. And so we talk a lot about him, and we then talk about his connections to what was going on with the Communist Party and movement in Harlem. And one of the links between those two things was this man, Claude McKay, who wrote for and worked for The Masses while also being part of the Harlem Renaissance. And so rather than approach this period through the lens of prohibition, which is how most people look at 20s New York City, we decided to approach it through the lens of communism because it was such a potent force in the city at the time. The other thing we do in this chapter that is about Greenwich Village is talk about dear departed Chumleys. So let me read from the book here. For years, as I led groups through the West Village, I would see visitors doing a ritualistic dance outside the plain townhouse at 86 Bedford Street. They'd consult their guidebooks and shake their heads. And when they looked like they were giving up, I'd cross the road to ask, "Are you looking for Chumleys?" "Yes!" I'd push open the door of the house and gesture into the dark interior. Up those 4 stairs, down the ones on the other side, and there you are. They'd freeze. Trust me, you're in the right place. New York has had a proliferation of faux speakeasies in the past decade, but none compared to Chumley's, which was the real deal. Established as a bar in 1928, Chumley's began pouring drinks almost a decade into America's 14-year, quote-unquote, noble experiment with prohibition. It was a focal point of the Greenwich Village literary scene, both in the downstairs bar and an upstairs gathering spot for writers and intellectuals and communists, known simply as the meeting place. Like most illegal bars, it didn't bother with a password, it was simply hidden in plain sight. One name I sometimes see connected to Chumley's, even though he was long dead by the time it opened, is John Reed. Maybe that's because people link him to the area having seen the Warren Beatty film Reds. Just around from the corner from Chumley's is the Grove Street house Beatty used as a stand-in for Reed's address in Reds. It's not this. I'm showing this slide again because next time you go see Reds, and if you haven't seen it, please go see it, when you see him going up and down the stairs of the house in which they've had him live, which was not where John Reed really lived, you can see this in the background with the fire escape still on it. So, it dates that movie. I appreciate the fact that Beatty not only picked Grove Street because it could reasonably pass for 1915 to 1920, but also because it's a street that all of his characters would have known in real life. From communism, we moved to the Rockefellers. Langston Hughes went to the same high school in Cleveland as John D. Rockefeller Sr. And by the time Langston Hughes went there, he was a devout communist. We spent a lot of time talking about him. John Reed's books were required reading. And I just think that's fascinating that John D. Rockefeller and Langston Hughes went to the same school X number of years apart, and that's how much it had changed. After we do the Rockefellers, if you know Greenwich Village, you know this face. A chapter about Jane Jacobs and her nemesis. There he is. This is such a almost literary feud that it is in fact being turned into an opera right now. So that's Robert Moses. You all know that's Robert. That's Robert Moses, admiring very greatly a model of the bridge that was supposed to span New York Harbor from Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn. That's what is now the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, but it was originally supposed to be a Brooklyn Battery Bridge. So we talk about a little bit the fight to save Washington Square. I love these pictures, which show you exactly what Washington Square would have looked like if it had had multiple lanes of traffic running through it with a pedestrian bridge. You can see there, and in the picture, the illustration, you can see people nicely walking over the zooming traffic. We take people to another Moses project that did not get stopped, Washington Square Village, which was part of the whole title, whatever it is, housing. And really compare and contrast those two things and then walk people into Soho so that we can talk about Lomex, the Lower Manhattan Expressway, as Jane Jacobs' final victory in preserving a neighborhood. Then we come back to the Village so that we can talk about this young man. That's Bob Dylan and Susie Rotolo on the cover of Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. That is the two of them and Dave Van Ronk outside the Hyde House, which I was just showing you. You can see the nice little half moons on the shutters that were there. And one of the things that's really interesting in terms from a preservation point of view is that you can sometimes walk down a street in New York and see more of 1860s New York than you can see of 1960s New York. Things, when they reach a certain age, grow a certain, there's attachments and there's value. But, it's not like Kettle of Fish is still around. There's Jack Kerouac posing for a Gap ad in front of Kettle of Fish. There's the Gaslight gone. There's the one that's left, where Bob Dylan made his debut. That's what it looked like in 1966. And here's what it looks like today. Not all that changed. And we finish out the chapter with a little film festival. The final finish out the book with a little film festival, picking the movies, especially concentrating on the 1970s, but looking at their entire careers of Marty Scorsese, who went to NYU, and Woody Allen, who used to stand up on MacDougal Street, and looking at how their films, their New York films, are not only interesting representations, but often, one of the contrasts we make is that Taxi Driver and Annie Hall take place in the same universe, and they could not be farther apart from each other. And how does film work as a medium to tell truths or lies about a place? And that is a little, very quick, guided tour. It's a wonderful book. There's lots of copies over there, and you should in fact take one home. One program note before I open the floor to questions. Not only are the books for sale over there, if you are interested, we do public walks, we do other talks. We have a mailing list, email. I have to say this since someone scribbled down their postal address last time, and no. We have an email list, and if it's easier for you, we have a little box over there and you can just throw in your business card and we'll add you to our list, and we don't spam people. And you get invited to events like this, and that's it. It's not like you're going to get other stuff. If you are technologically, social network connected, our Twitter account, our Facebook page, our Instagram account, and our website. And you
don't have to copy those down because we have our business cards up here or over there, and all of the websites are linked.
So that's Footprints in New York. Thank you very much. And Michelle has one other comment before we start taking questions.
I don't think we said this already. You maybe noticed it as we were reading, that we say I in the book. We don't say we. Sometimes we're both together when we're having those experiences. Sometimes it's just me or just James, but we decided that the I sounded better, so it wouldn't sound like a royal we. So it goes back and forth between third person and first person singular as we're throughout the entire book. But we're happy to take any sort of questions. Yes?
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the colonnade, I'm saying it right, on Lafayette?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is that somebody's house or?
So it was built as a series of houses. It was the first...
It's 3 columns wide is one house.
Exactly, yeah, we can find that slide as we talk about it. It was, I'm going to get the year right by looking it up. 1827 is what I'm going to say. So yeah, as I'll read from the book, in 1825 or 1826, Lafayette Place was cut south from Astor Place to Great Jones Street. And in 1830, there we go, a developer named Seth Gear began constructing LaGrange Terrace. The houses were gigantic by any standard. Most had 26 rooms. Even though New York would not get running water until 1842, LaGrange Terrace had indoor plumbing and central heat. John Jacob Astor purchased number 37. Warren Delano, grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, resided at number 39. Other residents included Astor family members, a future two-term governor, and Julia Gardner, who would soon marry President John Tyler. So it was this Astor development. It talks about Seth Geer being the development, but this was an Astor development. It comes off of Astor Place. He's the one who named Lafayette because of the hero of the Revolution. And it was really, this was the first spot where if you said you lived on LaGrange Terrace, no one needed to know anything else about you. It's not. It's
not a full block. So this is wrong way.
So these are the ones that are left.
So on the other side of the street is the public theater. So you have the public theater behind you.
And it extended not even double this towards Astor Place.
And that's a very long block there. And if I remember correctly, the reason that was such a long block and why we don't have streets cutting through there is
Vauxhall Gardens was there, which was this pleasure garden that people went and strolled around in. We could talk about pleasure gardens at some other time. It was fascinating. There were like busts of Alexander Hamilton, you know, and you could walk through, and it was nicely planted, but you were also supposed to learn something while you were there. And so this area had never been developed, so Astor and Seth Geer could really start from scratch.
So I think that this might be, I could count how many columns, but this might be the whole thing. And so if we count every 3 columns, that's a townhouse wide. So if you imagine half a block long, half of a normal size block, but this happens to be a long block that it's on.
Yes?
Hi, early on you mentioned 75 and a half, which you said was the narrowest apartment.
Narrowest house, supposedly.
House apartment, right, house. I think that was where Edna St. Vincent Millay lived. But
It was.
When I photographed it, maybe 10 years ago, it looked completely different than when I saw it. Has it changed?
Well, not since she owned it. She and her husband were the people who, or rented it. Actually, they didn't own it. The Cherry Lane Theater owned it. They owned all that property. They owned the entire block, the Cherry Lane, when it was founded. And she was one of the founders of the Cherry Lane Theater. They're the ones who put the Dutch gabling on top that's up there. That's not original to that house. So anything, if you were able to find a picture pre-1920, whatever year she moved in, it wouldn't have that. They put it in. They were there very briefly. And not when she wrote the poems that won her the Pulitzer Prize, despite what the fat plaque says outside. They want more. They want it to have more gusto than it does.
And I personally don't know if it had anything attached to it in the 1950s, 60s, 70s that has been subsequently stripped away. So I don't know if a photograph from that era would look different.
But 10 years ago, it looked like it looks today. Except the interior's been renovated.
The lady that lived in the merchant's house, was she never married? Is that what it was?
No, and the reason that we start that story talking about Catherine, you can talk about this, I don't need to step in for answer every question. Catherine Sloper from Washington Square and Gertrude Treadwell, who actually lived in that house, have a lot in common. And Catherine Sloper never married because Morris Townsend was no good Nick. And Gertrude Treadwell, at least some people believe, she had one suitor, his name was Lewis Walton. Her father didn't want them to get married because he was a Catholic. And then that was it. She was soured on love. But that's one interpretation. The woman who's written the great book about this, her name's Mary Knapp, and she wrote a book about the Merchant's House Museum. She also points out that Gertrude watched her sisters get married and raise families and maybe said, you know, this is not for me. So it could very well have been, you know, women in the 19th century lacked a lot of agency, but she had the choice to not get married. And that may what, right, because she had the money to not get married.
Yes.
Is it just an empty rumor that Chumley's has reopened?
Inshallah, it will open someday. They just pushed it. There's an article in the Times just 2 days ago about how they've pushed the opening back to 2015. So every article you read, they've pushed the opening back. So Chumley's. So we'll believe it when we see it.
A literary question. Claude McKay, is he a model for the hero of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison? I've never seen it mentioned, but
They knew each other.
They knew each other.
I know they knew each other. I don't know that. I've never seen it mentioned
It
either.
seemed to make sense.
That's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
I'd just like to mention that the Merchant Art Museum is open and available to be seen, and you can actually really get a good picture of what 18...
Absolutely, and so one of the things we talk about in here is we're visiting mostly places that you can visit. This book is not a guidebook, but if you go to our website, a lot of which is footprintsinNewYork.com, we have cards. We've set up a resources page that talks about the places that we visit in the book that you should visit, and Merchant's House Museum is absolutely one of them because they do both guided tours, but if you come when that's not happening, a very, very well written self-guided tour that takes you from the basement to the rafters.
They have holiday themes like.
Yes, they're doing an October thing, they're doing a Halloween thing now, they do lots of good Christmas things. It's well worth the visit. In the back.
Speaking of resources, the Museum of the City of New York on 102nd and 5th has the most fabulous film. It's called Timescapes, and it basically shows like New York City from the inception, so back when the Dutch came, and it just goes all the way to now. It's a really great film.
They do have that, and I don't know if you know that, so that's Timescapes, which is the film at the Museum of the City of New York, which if you want to see a nice capsule history, it shows on all day while the museum is open. I think because of that, now if you go to the New York Historical Society, they have put together their own film that tells the entire history of the city of New York, and everybody who goes in gets free admission to that. And that's all sort of like very bombastic, and Liev Schreiber is the... and they're both worthwhile. You know, if you're not a devotee of those two museums, you should be, because, you know, if you love New York, they each have fantastic programs. One more?
You didn't mention the Ear Inn built 1817 on Spring Street.
I'm sorry, the...
Ear Inn.
No, only because it is one of the things that we don't visit in this book. You know, we had to, for example, that chapter, we're trying to connect Gertrude Treadwell to Washington Square because of her life and the novella, and so we concentrate on those things. There are, as you might guess, you know, there are 19 chapters in this book. There are 19 million chapters we could have written for this book, and for each one we had to pick, you know, a theme and a person, and it is by no means an exhaustive catalog of places that you can visit, but we do think we get into the sort of the nitty-gritty of an era.
That's one more.
One more. I have one more in the back.
When you were talking about the 1880s Lower East Side, there was only one picture. Was that a picture? What was that a picture of? Is that, do you know?
I can go to that.
You can talk.
Is that 5 Point?
Well, it's near 5 Points. It sort of stopped to exist at that point. It is in, if you've ever been to Columbus Park, aka Mulberry Bend Park, this is the Bandit's Roost, which was at the Bend in Mulberry Bend. And I picked this picture when I was putting the slideshow together because we happened to mention it in the book. We don't reproduce it. You know, if I had this book to do all over again, it'd have a lot more pictures, but as it is, the trim size and the number of page count dictated a lot of things. One of which is that we get to have one picture for each chapter. So we had to pick. So, what?
Do you visit that? Do you
In the book, we visit this spot. Yeah, we talk about.
That's on Mulberry?
That is where Columbus Park, if you're in it, you go straight up, and about halfway through the park, it does a kink over to that way. That is the bend of Mulberry Street that gave its name to the park. Used to be called Mulberry Bend Park, and where the bend was an alley, and in that alley were these folks, and so we talk about not only Reese and his photojournalism and all the things he did, but how he was the advocate for tearing down this and all of the tenements in that area so that the park could be built. I mean, his idea of making the neighborhood better was to kick all the people out. That's a whole complicated story, but... So we're happy to sign if people, and we're happy to take questions while we're doing that. We're happy to give you cards, talk to you, do whatever you want to. Book's $20.
Got